Arthur, different philosophical traditions try to look at the world and say what really exists. There's matter, and there's spiritual world, and Platonic objects. From Judaism's point of view, and some of the great Jewish philosophers, how do they approach this question of existence? What are the big categories of all there is?
I think one has to divide this question into several parts. I think if you take, let's say, the beliefs of ordinary Jews, and I think in religion you have to deal with ordinary people to begin with. What exists is the world, the sensory world that we have. And Judaism is basically interested in that because a halacha, or Jewish law, is very much interested in day-to-day life, what one does, all the way from how one prays to what one eats, relation between men and women, marriage, divorce. Now, there's a very strong emphasis on that aspect. But this does not mean that this is everything, because if you look at the Bible, there are many other thoughts. For example, God exists, and God certainly in Judaism is not physical. It's a totally different level of existence. There is talk about angels, which seem to be people who live forever, who might have bodies, might not have bodies. Again, there's no clear kind of division here. So the Midrash even speaks about God in physical terms.
Midrash being the commentary.
The Midrash being the commentary on the Bible and the rabbinic tradition.
Yes.
That would speak about God in physical terms, the arm of God. God brought the Israelites out of Egypt with a strong arm, the eyes of God, and so on. So the issue of levels of existence, or even such issues as the nature of God, functions really at least on three levels. The level of the ordinary person, who might think of God really very much in physical terms. Now, this would not be acceptable to philosophers, and it would not be totally acceptable to mystics, to Kabbalists. What philosophers, such as Maimonides, the great Jewish philosopher of the Middle Ages, speaks about is really a world conceived along philosophic lines. There is a world of material things, there's a world of plants, there's a world of animals, there's a world of human beings, and then even with the philosophy of the time, there are even disembodied intelligences and celestial spheres. So what you would have here is, first of all, a very philosophic conception of the world in accordance with the philosophy of the period. And to cite just one example, Maimonides would be very much concerned with how one interprets physical descriptions of God. And he wrote a book called The Guide of the Perplexed, in the first part of which he tries to solve the problem by comparing biblical passages. So if you find in one passage that the passage speaks about the arm of God, and in another passage that the arm of God means the power of God, Maimonides, who has philosophic interests, would say you cannot take any of the physical descriptions of God in a literal way. You must interpret them. Now, Kabbalists, who have a somewhat different view,
Kabbalists being Jewish mysticism,
will see a kind of a continuity between the physical world and the divine world, so that what people do in this world would have some kind of effect on angelic beings or even on God himself. So I think the real answer to your question is that the question of reality functions really on different levels in accordance with two things. First of all, the kind of question that you ask, and second of all, the conceptual framework. But here again, Judaism is no different from other religions. So you would find on the Christian side, for example, that Aquinas is an analog to Maimonides, or Meister Eckhart would be an analog to Jewish Kabbalists. So in religion at large, you find at least these three ways of looking at reality, a kind of a common sense ordinary way, which ordinary believers generally would have, then a kind of a philosophic interpretation of religion. And here I want to emphasize that interpretation of religious beliefs and doctrines becomes very important. And then you find mystical interpretation.
That's the third way.
That would be the third way. So that depending on what your outlook is, first of all, your conception of reality would differ in accordance with the outlook, and also the efficacy of what you do. That, for example, prayers might have an effect in the upper world, might bring angels down to help you, things of that kind. Now, if you look at the Bible, there's talk about angels. You remember the story of Abraham, that after his circumcision, 3 angels visited him, and they predict that Sarah would have a child and so on. So that if you read that on a kind of a literal level, this, of course, would mean that angels came down and visited him, or angels climbed up and down a ladder with Jacob. Now, philosophers would take these ideas and interpret them in a more philosophic way, and mystics would take them and interpret them in a more mythical kind of way.
Really, in each of these 3 categories, the physical world, the philosophical way of interpreting, and the mystical world, Judaism, it seems very similar to other religions. Each one sort of has its own way of these 3 categories. Certainly Christianity and Islam seem very similar to Judaism in that respect.
Absolutely. Not only that, but there are cross-influences. To mention Maimonides once again, there was a person in the Provence, Maimonides lived in Egypt at the time, who translated the guide for the Perplexed, his major work, and he asked him apparently about books that he had in his library, what you think about them. Now, Maimonides gave an answer, but of the people whom he mentions, the philosophers whom he mentions, the majority are either Hellenistic philosophers or Muslim philosophers, and he mentions 2 Jewish philosophers, not in a very laudatory kind of way. Or Aquinas, for example, when he discusses God, mentions Maimonides, whom he knew through a Latin translation, and he agrees with some points, and he disagrees with others. So the main point I'm trying to make is that your conception of reality depends on your overall approach. If you approach it from sort of a common sense, ordinary point of view, you have one conception. If you approach it from a philosophic point of view, you have a quite different kind of conception because you have different problems. And if you approach it from a mystical point of view, you will still have another conception. And in my opinion, these different ways of looking at things coexist in religions. And you cannot say religion must either be commonsensical, philosophical, or mystical. More than that these groups sometimes fought with one another, that mystics would attack philosophers, and philosophers would attack the mystical conception of religion. So in the end, you sort of must choose how you interpret religion, and you get different conceptions of reality.